We're talking about the U.S. use of drones against suspected militants. Joining us now from New York is the executive director of Human Rights Watch, Kenneth Roth. He's led numerous investigations into alleged rights abuses and written extensively on such issues as international justice and counterterrorism. Kenneth, thanks so much for joining the broadcast with us. I've heard you say that the Obama administration should use policing rules rather than war rules when it comes to conducting drone strikes. Can you identify what the difference is for our audience?
Yes, no, that's a very important distinction, which is very much in play these days. In war, the rules are that you're allowed to shoot at combatants on the other side. You don't have to give them an opportunity to surrender. They don't have to pose an imminent threat. If they're a combatant in the opposing side's force, you can shoot them. That's the ugly reality of war. Those are the rules that the U.S. government has tended to follow in using drones. But starting last May, President Obama suggested that they may be moving to policing rules, which is something that Human Rights Watch has been very much advocating. And under policing rules, if you just think about a cop on the street, they can sometimes use lethal force, but only as a last resort and only to face an imminent lethal threat. Now, Obama basically mouthed those standards in his speech. He said that, only an ongoing imminent threat, only when arrest isn't possible. He even went further and said, only when there's a virtual certainty of no civilian casualties. So those are very good standards. The problem is it's not at all clear that they're being applied in the U.S. government's actual use of drones.
How do you nudge the administration more in the direction where you'd like to see them?
Well, the first thing that we've been doing is actually documenting the consequences of drone attacks. Many of these are conducted in remote areas of Yemen or the tribal areas of Pakistan. And there is always, a flurry of commentary and accusations about them, but there's very little on-the-ground analysis of what actually happened. So Human Rights Watch has actually been trying to conduct that analysis, and what we found has been disturbing. We've found a number of instances where the people targeted actually were not Al-Qaeda or not in any sense posing an imminent threat. In other cases, there may have been an Al-Qaeda member there, but there were other civilians around, and there's a real question as to whether the value of this particular Al-Qaeda suspect justified the killings of civilians. So the on-the-ground research that Human Rights Watch has been able to do really calls into question whether the Obama standards, as articulated in his speech, the policing standards, which we hope the U.S. would formally adopt, whether those in fact are guiding U.S. policy today.
You say calls into question, but there's been a lot of calling into question the statistics because they seem to be all over the map. Some people say a lot of civilians are dying. Some say no. These are very targeted precision strikes. How do we get at the truth?
Well, first of all, the U.S. government claim that civilians are never killed and that they always get the right guy is absolutely false. Human Rights Watch has definitively proven that. In fact, most recently, there was a wedding party that was struck in Yemen. And while there may have been, one or two Al-Qaeda members among the wedding party, the vast majority of people there killed were civilians. In other cases, just to cite examples where Human Rights Watch has done the actual research, there was one case where the U.S. actually got two Al-Qaeda people, but the two people with them were an imam who had spoken out against Al-Qaeda and a local police officer who was protecting that imam. That was a political disaster. In another case, an Al-Qaeda vehicle may well have gone down the road at a certain moment, but by the time the U.S. fired a drone, what it hit was a bus filled with civilians. So these are all cases where, sometimes there was a justification for aiming at a particular person, but clearly insufficient effort was made to avoid quite serious civilian casualties.
But there would be the argument that collateral damage is just inevitable in any war.
You can't apply a standard of perfection, but it is important to insist that people targeted only pose an imminent lethal threat. And frankly, even if some of these people targeted in Yemen, for example, were members of Al-Qaeda, there's very little evidence that they posed an imminent lethal threat to Americans or anyone else.
How about Anwar al-Awlaki? Was he an imminent threat?
Well, in this case, the reason al-Awlaki was so notorious as a target was because he was a U.S. citizen. And I think it's important to stress that while under the U.S. Constitution there are added protections given to a U.S. citizen, the standards that apply, whether under the laws of war or under policing standards, don't distinguish among nationality. And so the question really is, did he pose an imminent lethal threat? Now, in the case of al-Awlaki, the U.S. government claims that he was actively recruiting and inciting people to commit acts of violence against the United States. So the Human Rights Watch has not protested his killing on those grounds. But there are a number of other cases where we have documented these targeted killings, usually using drones, sometimes using other weapons, where there are major questions as to whether arrest was possible, whether there was an imminent lethal threat, whether the Obama standards are being applied in fact.
Well, President Obama makes this argument if it's an American, and he has this story he tells, you know, if you have a sniper on the rooftop and he's aiming at citizens below, I mean, the SWAT team ought to be able to take him out. He uses this analogy, draws this analogy. If he was talking to you and using that analogy, what would you say back to him?
I'd say he's absolutely right, because in that case, there's an imminent lethal threat, and arrest is extraordinarily difficult. The sniper's got a weapon pointing at you. That's the standard that he articulated in his May speech. That's not the standard that is being applied in many of these drone attacks. That this is not, you know, the unfortunate collateral consequence of war, but rather this is a, you know, complete lack of adequate care to ensure that only combatants or only people posing an imminent lethal threat are targeted, and to take all feasible precautions to spare civilians. Those are standards that are simply not being followed.
There's talk now of another potential American national being targeted by the Obama administration. Do you see this national as potentially an imminent threat?
Well, see, we don't really know the details there. And what this case has brought up, this case, even though they never say it explicitly, it by all appearances is in the tribal areas of Pakistan. And what complicates matters there is that Obama had promised to transfer drone attacks from the CIA, which has no history of accountability, no history of transparency, so we can keep track of what's going on. He promised to move these operations to the Pentagon, where, you know, at least there is a tradition of seeking to uphold the laws of war. The problem in Pakistan is that the Pakistani government won't let the U.S. military operate there. And so the U.S. is stuck still using the CIA, and a lot of people have qualms about letting the CIA go forward and conduct any drone attacks, let alone one that's targeting an American.
I heard former President George W. Bush addressing a crowd in Texas at one time and talking about how when he would sit down with another head of state, one of the favorite questions he'd ask in a quiet moment is, what keeps you up at night? And he said, you know, it was never very hard for me to answer, which is, you know, I want to prevent another terrorist attack against the United States. And undoubtedly, that's probably the same thing driving President Obama. So, you know, when people talk about policing rules and these sorts of things, if you're sitting in the Oval Office and there's the potential that the United States might be attacked and that American citizens might die, those rules don't look all that important to you as a president, I would think. So how would you frame your argument if you were to spend some time in the Oval Office to try and change the president's views on this?
I've actually spoken directly with President Obama in the Oval Office on precisely this point, so I'll tell you what I told him. And he frankly didn't disagree with me on this, that when you look at something like terrorism, the issue is not simply stopping this or that attack. And indeed, the U.S. has all sorts of mechanisms to monitor conversations among terrorists, to stop them if any attack is underway. But the real question is also, how are you avoiding the recruitment of the next generation of terrorists? And what we found is that when the U.S. acts in a lawless manner, whether it's the use of torture, the use of secret CIA detention facilities, the detention without trial in Guantanamo, or more recently, the use of drones in a way that doesn't take adequate precaution to avoid civilian casualties, this is a bonanza for the terrorist recruiters. This is exactly what they want, to keep the recruits coming and to ensure an ongoing lethal threat to the United States. So my point to President Obama, which he did not disagree with, is that yes, by all means, you have a duty to protect Americans, you have a duty to try to stop al-Qaeda, but you've got to do that lawfully. You've got to respect the laws of war when it is a war, and when it comes to many of these drone attacks in places like Yemen, you've got to respect policing standards, because this is not a war in any recognizable sense, and so you've got to abide by the more limited terms that would allow a police officer to use lethal force.
Kenneth, just take us to the future and extend out this argument, because once the genie's out of the bottle, it's hard to put the genie back into the bottle, and this technology is not just reserved for the United States. Obviously, it can go to other countries. We can see a future where it's almost wars by video games, where people are sitting with toggles and firing missiles at each other, and it's a rather antiseptic way, and yet it can be very lethal.
Yes. This is a very important point, because at this moment, the U.S. government has a relative monopoly over the lethal drone technology. There are a handful of other governments that have it, but the U.S. is the only one that is using it actively. This is the moment when precedents are set. Because it's easy to foresee tomorrow, say the Russians developing lethal drone capacity and going after Chechens in London or Vienna or wherever. They've already have a history of killing dissidents and Chechen activists in other countries. You can imagine them using drones to the same effect. You can imagine a number of other countries that would develop this capacity and use it in a lawless way if that's the precedent that the United States has set. On the contrary, if the United States clearly articulates the limits to these drone attacks and abides by those limits, that sets an important precedent that will protect all of us as this technology inevitably proliferates.
How come that argument isn't going over well with the American citizenry?
Well, the U.S. citizenry tends to be short-sighted. They tend to say, do whatever it takes to protect me. They don't recognize that protection that is based on lawlessness doesn't help, it actually hurts. And in the long term, it sets a precedent that's going to come back and haunt us.
And so how do you convince them?
Through shows just like this, through having this conversation and making people think about the broader issues at stake. It's not just a matter of stopping this particular possible attack. You've got to think more dynamically about how al-Qaeda recruits and what the broader global threats will be as more and more governments adopt this kind of lethal technology.
Well, Kenneth, can't thank you enough for joining us here on The Heat.
And my pleasure. Thanks for having me.